Now we're continuing on plate tectonics. We've looked at a number of the different patterns, but we'll go through a number of other factors relating to plate tectonics. So here we go. Here's the program. There we are. So we looked at one way that magnetic fields help show us factors relating to plate tectonics, specifically that when rocks form, magnetic bits in them can get stuck acting as little compasses, and then if the rock moves, say due to plate tectonics, then that records a clue as to where the rock was when it originally formed and what direction it was to the poles. One complication in the Earth's magnetic field is that instead of being like the familiar sort of magnet you might have with a fridge that's a solid that's basically permanently magnetic, the Earth's magnetic field is generated by the liquid iron that's moving around in the outer core. As the Earth spins, that stirs the liquid around, and something moving that conducts electricity sets up magnetic fields. But that's going to be much more complex and changing than the field associated with a standard magnet. One of the complications is that from time to time, Earth's magnetic field flips. And so the north needle on your compass would then be pointing south. And then after a while, flips back again, back and forth. It seems to be pretty random. There are studies recently that detect some degrees of patterns to it, but it's quite complex. We don't know exactly how to predict how it's going to behave. But for looking back at plate tectonics, we don't have to predict, we just have to see what it has done. Looking at this pattern gives us some nice records of plate tectonics through time. Ocean floor rocks, those relatively dense ones, you may remember relatively iron rich, so good levels of magnetic particles in them. And so as ocean floor is being created along the mid-ocean ridges, those new bits of lava as they cool, or magma if it's down deeper underground, will be preserving the pattern of magnetic polarity when that rock cools down. From time to time, the Earth's magnetic field flips. So as we go to older and older rocks, eventually we'll hit a point where the field's pointing the other way. Older still, it's back to the present, which is referred to as normal versus reverse polarity. I'm not quite sure why textbook PowerPoint designers pick colors that you can't really tell apart very well when the standard is to use black and white. But at any rate, we have the alternation of normal, what we refer to our present pattern as, and reverse polarity as we go through time. We can go to different parts of the world, look at rocks of different ages, and see which way the field goes, and we come up with a diagram like the one shown here, showing how the magnetic field has changed as we go back in time. So once we've got this pattern, that's one thing we can use to help figure out how old a rock is. If it's reversed, well, then it needs to be from one of those time periods when the field was pointing the other way. But also it's very useful in tracking the movement of the plates over time. We can measure this, and typically the approach rather than trying to dig up rocks from the bottom of the ocean and measure them directly, is to do a bit more large-scale measurement using a magnetometer on a ship or airplane and measure the overall magnetic field. If the rocks around line up with the Earth's present field, no more polarity, it'll be stronger than average. If the rocks are pointing the other way from Earth's field, it will cancel out part of the magnetism from the Earth today, and so you get a bit weaker. So from a mid-ocean ridge, we should expect to get patterns somewhat like this to either side. Down at the bottom of the diagram showing the actual measurements, what they're like. Again, the idea, Earth's field plus rocks that are pointing the same way in their magnetic field will make it a bit bigger. Earth's field plus rocks pointing the other way, the net result's a little weaker. And so when you go to a mid-ocean ridge, you indeed find this pattern, alternating stripes of the stronger and weaker polarity back and forth. The picture example is from Iceland, but you can find this anywhere around the world going out to either side of a mid-ocean ridge. So we'll have parallel bands arranged in a symmetric pattern, mirror image either side of the mid-ocean ridge. It was realized that this would be a good test of plate tectonics back in the early 60s. Vian Matthews got data for the Indian Ocean mid-ocean ridge and indeed found that mirror image pattern of normal and reversed magnetic stripes. Another fellow, Morley, had the same idea about the same time, but wasn't able to get it published. And so Vian Matthews tend to get a little more of the credit since they got it out first. This also tells us something about the ages and patterns there. Rocks forming, say right now, along the mid-ocean ridges, any blobs of lava that ooze out of the seafloor and cool there, well, those will be normal polarity, lining up with the modern magnetic field. And then plates pull apart a bit more. That bit of rock gets moved aside. New rock forms in the crack there. It's normal polarity. But over time, eventually, Earth's magnetic field will flip. Now the stuff that is forming would be reversed, and our normal polarity stuff that formed today rather than their future point would be further out to the side. And so over time, slowly these move out to the side, away from the middle of the mid-ocean ridge, down the slopes, down the flanks, becoming part of the abyssal plain, finally moving out all the way to the trenches. So this is showing us, as we go out from the mid-ocean ridge, seafloor is getting older and older. Sitting down the bottom of the ocean, that's more time for sand and mud to pile up. And so you have increasing thickness of sediment on the seafloor as we get away from the mid-ocean ridges. Also, middle of the ridge, well, it's a ridge, it's higher. Further and further out, it's getting deeper. And again, this fits with the younger versus older. The youngest stuff is hotter. Hotter, things expand, and being less dense, they'll float up higher on the asthenosphere. As they're moving away, getting older, they're cooling down, getting denser, sinking down. So we see the going down from the mid-ocean ridge out to the abyssal plains. We see sinking of what once was an island to become a guyot. This is showing lots of patterns matching well with what we observe in the deep ocean. How fast is this? We can measure it happening today using GPS satellites, and it's on the order of about 1 to 10 centimeters per year to either side. So point on one side, point on the other side is moving about 2 to 20 centimeters apart each year. Centimeters per year. That's not a unit we use very often. Miles per hour, okay, that's more familiar. But fortunately, plates aren't moving miles per hour. They're moving a lot slower than that. How fast is a few centimeters per year? Well, one way of getting a feel for that, if you take a look at your hand, and not too exciting to just sit there looking at it, but your fingernails are growing. You don't notice just looking, but you do have to trim them from time to time. You know that they do grow. Turns out fingernail growth is about the same speed as how fast the plates move. Obviously, trying to ride somebody's fingernail to get from here to Europe would not be a very efficient way of traveling. But over geologic time, such slow movement adds up to very large movement. Again, those magnetic anomaly patterns give a handy way of measuring, calculating the rates as things move out to either side. Here's a diagram showing the patterns of ages, just as we expect. We have the youngest in the red right along the mid-ocean ridges. Oldest, the blues, furthest out. Another thing you notice, the color bands are not the same size in different places. Now, true, partly this is a Mercator projection, so the Arctic's getting spread out and the equator squunched. But also, if we just stay on the equator, it's a lot wider red in the Pacific and in the Atlantic. Different plates are moving at somewhat different speeds. Pacific's been faster, so things have spread out a good deal more than in the Atlantic here. So some differences there. You can also see we've got some very old seafloor closest to us here in North Carolina. So here's a diagram of how the plates are moving. Now, keeping in mind, of course, the Earth actually is a globe, not a rectangle. So the plate motion can be better described as a rotation moving on the curved globe rather than straight line. That's why you see arrows that are seeming to kind of point different directions on the same plate, thinking how this would look on a globe. Again, you can see with the lengths of arrows, different plates are moving faster, slower, depending on where you are. These are the major plates. There are a number of small ones, especially kind of in the collision zones between larger plates that don't really show up on a map to scale. Okay. We've got expansion of mid-ocean ridges, but the Earth's not particularly growing, so we have to have plates being destroyed somewhere else. And so this is what is happening at the trenches, the deep sea trench areas, those deepest parts of the ocean where one plate is shoving under the other. In the Pacific Ocean, for example, is largely surrounded by trenches. And so Pacific Ocean sea floor is being shoved down under other plates, and Pacific is slowly getting smaller. Again, only by maybe 20 centimeters a year. So this isn't going to get you a discount by waiting until next year to fly to Japan, but over time it is getting smaller. Now, of course, again, we're all in one globe. One place getting smaller, someplace else has to be getting bigger. It's a little complicated. You can't just assume that one pattern is going to keep going indefinitely. But for right now, the Pacific is shrinking. Not too surprising, this collision, we're shoving one plate down under another. Sliding rock past rocks, pretty rough. And so we have lots of earthquakes, volcanoes associated with these areas. Somewhat inconvenient to be living near there, but it does mean that we can use earthquakes nicely to help tell how plates are moving, where the boundaries are, things like that. Here's a map of large earthquakes. Now, there are small earthquakes all over the place all the time. Those don't tell us too much. But the larger ones are quite strongly concentrated along the plate boundaries. Yes, you get a few here and there that are further from the boundaries, especially areas where we do a lot of measuring, say in the US. But overall, it's not too hard to see where a lot of the plate boundaries are, especially the ones where the boundaries are collision zones. Here are maps of several different things that relate to the plate motions. Topography, just the shape of the Earth's surface, major mountain chains, where we have land, where we have ocean. These are important clues to plate boundaries. Earthquakes actually are the most important clue. We define the plate boundaries to be at the zones where we see the concentrations of earthquakes. Heat flow coming from Earth's interior. Again, that's associated with the mid-ocean ridges, the spreading zones where two areas are moving apart. That's where we have higher heat coming from Earth's interior. We see not much distinctive on other plate boundaries with the type of heat flow. Volcanoes. Yeah, we got some out in the middle there. Not all are at plate boundaries, but the majority of volcanoes also are along plate boundaries. Not only are earthquakes associated with plate boundaries, but different types of earthquakes are associated with different boundaries. Very deep earthquakes, for example, are only associated with the deep ocean trenches, a ocean plate being shoved under some other plate, whether it's under another ocean plate or ocean going under continent. So you see the areas colored in here. These are the areas that have very deep earthquakes, deeper than around 300 kilometers into the Earth. So Earth's surface is made up of several individual plates in the lithosphere. The edges extend all the way through the lithosphere, so that's again the crust plus the top part of the mantle. And we recognize just where they are by the pattern of earthquakes of seismicity. We also can find things like the deep ocean trenches, mid-ocean ridges, major transform faults, things like that that mark the edges as well. Now, yeah, this is a big thing. The exact boundary, it's complicated. You can't precisely say right here, this exact spot is the plate boundary. But you can say it's in this zone here. Earthquakes, volcanoes concentrated on the plate boundaries. So here's a diagram, again, the earthquakes plus the plate boundaries shown in there. And we see concentrations lining up pretty well. Now, again, it varies. Some boundaries have much more than others. You see the kind of dashed line here for the boundary between the North American and Eurasian plate. This does show that actually a chunk of Northeast Asia is actually on the North American plate, but also dashed line, because we're not exactly sure where it is, it's relatively quiet. So not that many earthquakes to show us where it is, course, also in the middle of Siberia, there aren't nearly as many people there, and Russia isn't necessarily the best one for sharing data to help more precisely know where the boundary is. Others, for example, the boundary between the Pacific and North American plate along here that's very conspicuous. Lots of earthquakes there, lots of volcanoes, quite easy to identify. Volcanoes, along with plate edges shown here. Again, we've got some exceptions, but overall, they tend to match up pretty well, most of them being at plate boundaries. How do plates move? You can't just push on the ground and move in North America. We need something a lot bigger than that. And that was, you may remember, one of the big obstacles to acceptance of the idea of moving plates. What could power it? They're able to move because we have the asthenosphere, that squishier zone, plastic rock that can bend, and so the lithosphere on top of that is able to move not only up and down, but also side to side. And so that is what means that they can move, but we also need to think about what can power that. Wegener, in his continental drift model, best he could come up were the tidal forces from the gravity between the Earth and the Sun and the Moon. That'll nicely move ocean up and down, give us tides, but that's too small. Likewise, the centripetal forces from the Earth's spin, that's too small. That was known at the time. It was the best he could come up with, but it wasn't good enough. The prime idea that really got plate tectonics accepted was the idea of convection happening in the mantle. You remember that Harry Hess talked about that as a mechanism. Again, what's happening in convection is we have a volume of something that's where the part's able to move around. Hotter stuff will tend to rise up, and colder stuff tend to sink down. So we get these loops of movement, hotter rising, colder sinking. This happens in the air quite easily, very important for weather. It's happening quite spectacularly in association with Hurricane Isaias right now as I'm talking. It happens in water. Hot water rising up, colder sinking down, whether we're thinking about parts of the ocean or in a pot on the stove. And it also can happen in the mantle where we have rock that is plastic enough to bend and move. It's very slow, but it does happen. And these days, by careful analysis of earthquake waves, we can actually get a picture of these loops of circulation moving down inside the mantle. Another thing, having hotter stuff rise up in certain areas, a big zone of rising rock, well then what's above that's going to be pushed up. And so what's up, gravity pulls down. So we have kind of a push out coming from the mid-ocean ridges. At the other end, the old colder rock sinking down at the old end of the plate at the trench. As that sinks deeper down, it's going to pull the plate behind it. So we have the mantle convection. We've got the push out from the ridge. We've got the pull down at the trench. As that rock that formed up at Earth's surface goes deeper into the Earth, it gets under a lot of pressure much more than just the weight of air and maybe some water, depending on where it formed. And eventually those minerals are going to squash down into more compact forms, change their crystal structure, become different minerals. If you have a great big huge chunk of plate that all of a sudden squishes down smaller, now it's denser, it will help weigh it down, but also that gives you a rather big earthquake. Fortunately, it's also a very deep earthquake, and so it doesn't do much damage at the surface, but it looks impressive on your seismometer. Something really big happened way down there. Eventually, the old dense end of the plate can break off and sink further down. But as that breaks off, it's surrounded by the rock, and so it creates suction. Kind of the same idea as you've got your foot in mud trying to pull it out. And so that suction also helps pull the plate behind it. Okay, so we've got these 4 different factors. What's most important? Well, it's kind of tricky to tell. You can't experiment on a whole plate very easily, but it looks like probably the most important is generally the sinking rock down at the trench, pulling the plate behind it. Now, of course, not all plates have a trench at the edge. That's not the only thing moving them, but that seems to be the most important based on what we know currently. Another feature that gives us a nice way of tracking plate movement is the occurrence of mantle plumes. These are structures that originate deep in the mantle. Now again, it's a little tricky to tell what's way down there, but from the best current studies, at least most mantle plumes start all the way near the bottom of the mantle, close to the top of the core. And so this hot rock rises. As it rises, it's under less pressure and can melt, so you get some magma forming associated with that. And so eventually, as it reaches the surface, this hot material hitting the bottom of the lithosphere can cause melting there, and eventually volcanism up at the top. And so the volcanic area on top of this mantle plume is known as a hotspot. Originating deep down, they can occur here and there, anywhere on Earth. Some of them are out in the middle of the plate somewhere. Some of them are near plate boundary. It varies, but it turns out that one, especially if it's far from a plate boundary, no particular complications there, will do a very nice job of tracking plate motion. So the basic idea is our mantle plume coming up from deep down in the earth builds a volcano on the plate, but that plate's moving. So as our plate goes along, we were making a volcano here, but plate's moving, and that volcano eventually moves too far off, no longer getting new lava, and we start making new volcano behind that one. So as the plate moves along, we're going to get one volcano after another forming. The active volcanoes will be right at where the spot is, and we'll get older and older volcanoes as we go along the line, getting further and further in the direction the plate's moving. Now, that's a somewhat simplistic picture, assuming that the mantle plume just stays put entirely as the plate moves. In reality, it's more complex. Yes, the mantle plume can have some moving, may not be entirely straight up, but it does make a nice marker showing how the plate has moved along. We'll be looking at this in a good deal of detail in one of our labs. So here's another diagram version. We have the mantle plume over here, creating a hot spot at the surface. So here's our active volcano. As this volcano's been forming, this older volcano has moved off the hot spot as the plate goes along. Volcano is not forming anymore, but we still have coral, stuff like that growing, forming a reef around it. As the top erodes, we end up with a fairly flat island. Also, as we move away from the hot spot, the rock here is getting cooler and is tending to sink down. And some of that's kind of underacted a little bit by the erosion decreasing the weight. So you've got some up and some down going on, but long term, it's cooling, getting denser and sinking. Also, if our plate is moving like this, that suggests that way off in the other direction somewhere is the mid-ocean ridge. So our whole plate, as it moves along, is also cooling, getting denser and sinking. What was the hot spot area is getting cooler, denser, sinking. And eventually our reef can no longer keep up, and our geode, what was our flat island, sinks, becomes the geode, going deeper and deeper down as the plate moves along. The most famous example of this pattern, and the one that we'll look at in detail in lab, is with the Hawaiian Islands. The active volcanoes are on the Big Island, a little confusingly also called Hawaii, as well as the whole group being called Hawaii. As the picture here suggests, in general, the volcanic eruptions from a volcano that's a hot spot out in the ocean are relatively calm, good tourist attraction. Now, it looks like this fellow needs to keep a bit of an eye on the grass, that the fire doesn't get too close to him, but it looks like he should be able to walk away, and that'll generally be enough to get away from this flow here. Now, you do need to be careful, use some common sense. I did hear about one geologist that was trying to study the freshest lava he could, so he was in Hawaii taking samples right at the flow. And then he realized he had a bit of a problem because his backpack was on fire. Should have let that rock cool a little longer before putting it in. So you do have some risk. You had a couple folks who got injured with the eruptions this past, no, what's it now, 2 years back. And there were a number of homes and a car or two parked that were damaged as well. Here's an example of a hotspot that's on land. Again, hotspots can occur randomly here and there around the globe. So not all of them are ocean. Some can be under continent rock. The most famous example of this is Yellowstone. All those fun things like the hot springs and geysers and whatnot are hot because most of Yellowstone Park is actually in the crater of a big volcano. It has undergone a number of eruptions in the past, and presumably some point in the future we'll see more eruptions coming from it. The picture up to the left is of an ash layer from a previous eruption from the Yellowstone hotspot system. And this is in northeastern Nebraska, as in basically two great big western states away. Good distance. And you see a section labeled as the dead zone with no fossils. Down below, we have a layer that has quite a diversity of skeletons from prehistoric creatures that were roaming the area at the time. And then with the eruption, now of course, this was far enough away, things weren't hot, it was just ash covering everywhere. Volcanic ash is made up of tiny fragments of glassy rock. And besides just burying things and being a problem that way, little tiny shards of glass. Not good for you, they poke. If you get lots of little tiny shards of glass in you, say if they're covering all the food and in the water and everything like that, then you're getting poked by these little bits all the time and getting lots of small-scale internal bleeding, and eventually you die, and it's pretty painful in the meantime. Not a fun way to go. A lot of these fossils show signs that they experienced these sorts of problems before dying. And then we have a zone where there doesn't seem to have been anything particular living in the area for a while. There's a little bit where there's footprints, herd of elephants walk past, didn't stay. And then finally you start to see some roots and traces of living things coming into the area once more. So continent, again, we've got that less dense, lighter colored rock. Turns out also that rock tends to melt at a lower temperature and be more thick, gunky when it is melted. And so that's much better for clogging up your volcano, building pressure. The rock typical of ocean floor, that darker, denser rock, melted. It's hotter and runnier. So gases in the magma are largely able to bubble out, and so eruptions are relatively calm. Look, there's a lava flow coming in the volcano. Get your camera out. Don't stand there in front of it and let it run over you, but other than that, you're probably okay. The thick, gunky lava associated with the continent-type rocks, that will tend to build up more and more pressure until finally, boom! And we have a big violent eruption. So continent hotspots, much more dangerously explosive. What happens if we let plate tectonics run for quite a while? That's something that Tuzo Wilson started thinking about, and hence we talk about the Wilson cycle, a pattern of events that can occur if we have plate tectonics happening for long enough time in a particular area. Basically, we can have a rift start to open up, a continent begins to split apart. We're getting a zone of rising hot material under a continent. And so instead of a mid-ocean ridge, because it's not ocean above, we start to get area kind of bulging up somewhat and splitting apart. So we'll get a series of rift valleys, kind of like the ones down the middle of the mid-ocean ridges, but on land. If it keeps going, doesn't always, but if it does, eventually that'll get wide enough that ocean can flood into these valleys, and we get a narrow ocean, and we'll start to have ocean floor type rock basalts forming along the cracks as they pull apart. If that keeps going, instead of that narrow sea between the split parts of the continent, we'll get a very broad ocean. But by the time that ocean's very big, the stuff that formed way back when it was just beginning is now getting pretty old, pretty cold, pretty dense. And so if it has a chance, it can potentially start to sink down. We can form trenches. And now that big ocean is starting to shrink again. If that keeps up long enough, eventually the continents on either side will collide, and we no longer have an ocean in between. Instead, with continent-continent collision, we'll be pushing up big mountains. Here it is summarized in a chart version. Our embryonic version, hot material is rising up, so we have uplift. The land is somewhat elevated, and it's also pulling apart, so we have cracks and valleys forming. The best modern day example of this would be the East African Rift system. The Great Lakes of East Africa, like Victoria, Tanganyika, Malawi, these are formed in the deep valleys produced due to what's now the east edge of Africa, okay, Somalia down through about Mozambique or so. That is actually pulling away from the rest of the continent. If that keeps going long enough, eventually it will be wide enough for the ocean to flood into the valleys, and we'll get a narrow sea, the two sides fairly parallel. Red Sea is our best modern example of that sort of thing. Not too long back in the geologic past, Arabia was attached onto North Africa, but it started to pull apart, and the Red Sea formed in between the two there. Gulf of California is somewhat similar, but it's a little more complex. You've got some sideways motion as well going on there. If something like the Red Sea keeps on widening, eventually we'll have a very broad ocean. The tectonic action is there in the middle along the ridge, so the continent edges beside it are pretty quiet geologically. The Atlantic is a good example of that. Back with the break of Pangea, initially we would have had narrow structures like the Red Sea, but now the Atlantic is quite wide. Along the east coast of North America, for example, things are pretty calm geologically. We don't have lots of earthquakes and volcanoes, though some earthquakes, it's not non-existent. But the ocean floor rocks off our coast here are pretty old, pretty dense and cool, and potentially we could get sinking down at a trench. We do have some trenches associated with the Caribbean, where there's another plate in there as well. So we could end up with a situation more like the Pacific. Pacific Ocean has trenches around most of the edges, and with those either volcanic island arcs or volcanic mountain chains along the edges there. And the Pacific is slowly shrinking while the Atlantic is still growing. If that shrinking keeps going, eventually we'll be left with a narrower sea with more irregular sides, not matching each other, and young mountains being pushed up in the collisions nearby. Like the Mediterranean, we have volcanoes, we have lots of earthquakes. This is due to the Mediterranean being a remnant of the Tethys Sea trapped between Africa and Europe as they are coming together. If that keeps on going, eventually we'll totally lose the sea, and then we'll have a continent-continent collision. Again, less dense rock, so it doesn't go down, it goes up. And we'll have a great big tall mountains like the Himalayas, where India is colliding into Asia. Before India ran into Asia, we had another chunk of the Tethys Ocean in between, and so we had a narrow Mediterranean-like sea. Before that, the Tethys was a large ocean like the Pacific. We can go back further still to other stages. The Appalachians, of course, these days, they're not nearly as impressive looking as the Himalayas, but they form in continent collision way back before the dinosaurs and have been eroded since then, as well as there's some uplift, other things going on. It's not totally quiet, but they are the remnants of a collision like that. Now again, at each stage, it's if it keeps going. At any of these stages, it may not keep going. Again, it depends on what all the other plates around the globe are doing to put this together. For example, towards the middle of the US, extending down from Lake Superior area, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Michigan, down through Mississippi River Valley region, there's a zone of very dense rock. North America actually started to split apart. Started to get some of those denser rocks forming in the cracks and stopped. Didn't keep on splitting apart. We're still attached to the west coast. And it's basically stayed that way since. So this is not automatic that it has to go through these, but it is a pattern that we do see happening long term if we look at various areas. For example, the rocks that we're on here in Boiling Springs are ones that were caught in between as a smaller plate converged into the edge of North America. So we had an ocean formed by a split, the Iaptus Ocean, went through the sequence of rifting, narrow sea, broad, wide, mature Iaptus Ocean, shrinking, narrow, irregular sea, and collision. On beyond that, we also had the Rhaetic Ocean on the other side of that small plate that opened, got wide, shrank, closed, and collision, closing, making Pangea. So we will pause here.